Today we're discussing first turn advantage in 9th edition and why I think it's one of the areas that the game could improve at the moment. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics for another discussion type video, where we're going to talk about first turn advantage, why it gives you an advantage in 40k, and why I feel the 9th edition missions aren't quite as good at mitigating it compared with the chapter approved 2019 mission pack. In general, with any game where you have one player that goes first and activates with their entire army first before the second player has any chance to do anything, you're generally going to have some sort of natural advantage. While 40k remains an I go, you go game, it's always going to have this problem compared with some other games that have alternating activations, where people take it in turns to move and activate units rather than their entire army. First turn advantage has usually been a problem for 40k, though I think that the missions towards the end of 8th edition did a really decent job of trying to address it. The main advantage for going first is pretty obvious. If you get your units to activate and shoot up a bunch of the enemy units, then any losses that the opponent sustains basically puts them at a disadvantage going into their own turn 1. Even if they just lose a small chunk of their army, maybe 300 points out of a 2000 point army, that still means that they're essentially playing 1700 points versus 2k on their own first turn. It's particularly potent to lose these units early on in first turn, as the lost units have the potential to have an entire game worth of activating and killing the enemy army, so they've potentially been robbed of up to 5 turns worth of action. This is generally known as the Alpha Strike in 40k, an initial big punch usually with shooting to remove a lot of enemy units before they have any chance to react. And in certain matchups, particularly those without much line of sight blocking terrain, you could lose really significant chunks of your army turn 1. I honestly think it's a little bit less of a problem in 9th edition. They're very much still present in the game, though I do think it was even worse in earlier 8th edition, where you could easily lose upwards of 500 points of your army straight away. It puts you in a very difficult position to come back from. In 9th, with the majority of the missions being very objective focused, it also gives you a secondary advantage of going first, as you can get all of your units up to the centre of the board and contest those objectives from a position of power. If the game does turn into a bit of a close range melee scrap, then it's usually better for it to be happening in your opponent's drop zone rather than yours, as it means that all of the objectives behind that should hopefully be safely in your hands. Basically, first turn gives armies both an advantage in terms of killing enemy units, and also gaining board control, gaining control of objectives, or just outmanoeuvring the enemy army to put them on the back foot. I thought that in 8th edition chapter approved 2019, they actually did a pretty decent job of rectifying this. Sure, the attacker still got all of these hefty advantages of going first, but they also had to suffer various different disadvantages. The player going second was able to pick the size of the deployment map, which could give them a bit of an advantage in terrain. The second player got to see exactly where their opponent had deployed, so you could potentially out-deploy them and hide your units away from their scariest guns. Or maybe do crafty things like outranging the enemy, or deploying appropriate counter units to counter the attacker's army. On top of this, they could also potentially use prepared positions to get their army better cover saves, and a lot of the chapter approved 2019 missions often had objectives that ended at the end of the battle round rather than the end of the player turn, as most of them seem to be in 9th. If objectives happen at the end of the battle round, then it basically gives the second player an advantage, as it means that they could potentially jump onto those objectives in their turn, and the attacker wouldn't have a chance to reactively push them off them, or they could potentially just target isolated attacker units that are securing objectives, and clear them off just before they score. It's a very significant advantage to the player going second. Overall, I think that they had quite a good balance. These are all very significant advantages, but then so is getting the Alpha Strike. Prior to chapter approved 2019, the only real advantage that they tended to have was the seize the initiative mechanic, which people have mixed feelings on, but I wasn't the biggest fan of. Sure, it did reward the player going second, but only 1/6 of the time, and that 1/6 of the time it gave them pretty much an overwhelming advantage with literally all the advantages on, so it still made a skewed game but in the other direction. In 9th edition though, pretty much all of those advantages have gone. You can score points in-game either via primary objectives or secondary objectives. Primary objectives are scored in your command phase, so basically both players will have the chance for their opponent's army to gun them down before they can be scored, so I don't think that the primary objectives really favour either player, and probably have a slight advantage to the player going first, seeing as they're the first ones that are able to move up to the centre of the board if they want to and it makes sense to. The secondary objectives also aren't end of battle round scoring whatsoever either. A lot of them tend to be around killing stuff, which can be done at any point, or a lot of them tend to be just progressive objectives that happen at the end of the player turn. There are a couple of exceptions, such as raise the banners, which I think has a slight small second turn skew, because if you raise any banners at the end of the last battle round, then it means that you'll have one free turn to score them where your opponent can't do anything about them. I think that's only all that relevant though if you reach turn 5 and both armies are still active and able to counter each other, which usually isn't the case. Usually someone's gained the upper hand by this point. The other one that I think has a very slight second turn player advantage is the attrition objective. This one has a second player advantage, I think, because it's scored at the end of the battle round. Basically, you need to kill more enemy units than your opponent kills of you by the end of that battle round. That means if you're the player going second, you already know how many units the first player has killed, so you have that information just to push for maybe one more unit than they killed and hopefully gain the objective for attrition. Still though, I think these are only going to be selected just as and when if it makes sense for your army, so they're only going to make any effect in certain games. In 9th edition 40k, there really is very little reason to go second, I think, besides playing some sort of game of perhaps baiting the opponent forward to expose them to a powerful beta strike. It would seem that these initial feelings that I had are backed up by the stats. There was a very good analytics-based article made by Warhammer recently that I thoroughly recommend you checking out, and I'll link it down in the video description below. Basically, they ran some numbers based on who'd gone first or second in a bunch of tournament games, and it turned out that across the course of lots and lots of games, it seemed that if you went first, you had a 57% chance of winning the game, and I'd say that's a pretty significant deviation compared with the 50-50 that you'd ideally want it to be if going first and second was truly balanced. According to their numbers, it does really seem that going first has a big advantage. Now I think there are some mitigating factors that make any individual army or game a little bit less dependent on going first. I think that if you either have an incredibly durable or incredibly mobile army, then going first is going to be less of a big deal for you. Mobile armies could potentially hide out of line of sight if there's decent terrain turn 1, and then jump forward when their opponents advance and maybe get a bit of a beta strike on them. Hide everything, then hit them very hard, so really you kind of get the first punch. Very durable armies might only lose a very small portion of their army to the first turn alpha strike, and then be able to basically carry on pretty much just as normal, with only a minor disadvantage. Comparatively, if you're playing really quite a fragile army that was very hard hitting, they're going to be very susceptible to being alpha striked, as if your units have low durability, then you're going to lose a lot more of them to enemy firepower, so the first turn swing is going to be a much bigger deal. I don't think that durability or mobility would actually give you an advantage to going second, but I think they would feel the pain of going second a little bit less. As it has been throughout all of 8th edition, having good line of sight blocking terrain is another really good mitigating factor to stop armies that go first just blowing their opponents straight off the tabletop. If both players are able to hide their most important units out of line of sight, then the outcome of the game is going to be a lot less dependent on winning that first turn dice roll. Much in the same way that if you play on Planet Bowling Ball with absolutely no line of sight blocking terrain, then a shooty army is just going to be able to hoover their opponent off the table straight away. Again, I still wouldn't say that good line of sight blocking terrain completely negates the first turn advantage, but I think it makes it far, far smaller. In general, I think that this is one of the main areas that Games Workshop could improve the core rules of 9th edition. I'm honestly surprised they didn't build in some sort of disadvantage to going first, and basically gave them almost nothing but advantages. I personally don't really think it actually matters too much exactly what the disadvantage is. You could go back to one army reactively deploying to the other, give the second player a choice of which board edge they deploy on, though of course that's only meaningful if you're not playing on a table that's got a perfect mirror match of terrain, or have more end of battle round objectives as opposed to lots of ones that end on the same player's turn. I think I do personally prefer these sort of solutions to things like prepare positions, which are just a bit wonky as some armies can make good use of them, and to some armies they're pretty much no use at all. So let me know what you think of the first turn in Warhammer 40k. Is it too much of an advantage at the moment? And if you were to mess around with the game's rules a bit, then what might be a good way of fixing it so things are a bit more balanced? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to check out my others. I've got plenty of other 40k related content on the channel, with more coming out every day, so feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more. If you'd like to help support the channel, I'd just like to mention that I do have a Patreon page, which is linked down in the video description below, and the channel's Patreon is why I can keep these videos coming quite so regularly. If you are enjoying a lot and would like to support, then the link's down in the video description. Channel Patrons get to see videos early each week, there are regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and you're also automatically entered into the Auspex Tactics giveaway each month with a chance to win some very big kits no matter where you are in the world. If any of that sounds good, then feel free to have a look down in the description, but in any case a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.